After massive protests this month in Cuba, many are calling for the U.S. to end the trade embargo. But will that help Cubans? And what does the embargo actually do? Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. On July 11th, Cubans took to the streets in record numbers to protest shortages of power, medicine, food, vaccines, and in particular, freedom. This is Miguel Diaz-Canel, recently appointed the first secretary of the Cuban Communist Party. Basically, he's the new dictator, or as he prefers to be called, president. And in response to the protests, he did what any good leader would do. He blamed the United States, particularly the U.S. embargo. That's nothing new, except that now the U.S. embargo on Cuba has found itself center stage in the media. Several countries have publicly expressed disapproval of the embargo, including Mexico, Vietnam, Barbados, and China. No surprise there. Meanwhile, in the United States, all sorts of big names have been coming out against the embargo, including Bernie Sanders, Black Lives Matter, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, among many other progressives. AOC's statement in particular sparked a negative reaction from some Democrats and a lot of Republicans. Cuban-American Senator Marco Rubio has been an outspoken supporter of the embargo for many years. He had this to say about the people calling for an end to the embargo.
Well, I would say most of the people that give those opinions don't even know what the embargo is or how it works.
I'm sorry, Senator, are you saying that Americans should know what they're talking about before they give their opinions? Well, that's the end of CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and my new YouTube channel, Opinions Uninformed. It would have been great. But Senator Rubio is not wrong. Many people don't know how the embargo works. From those who believe Cuba cannot trade with any country, to those who believe Cuba cannot receive food from the United States. Like this senator who said he had introduced legislation to lift our trade embargo to allow American-produced food to reach Cuba. So how does the embargo work? Well, it started more than 60 years ago. President Eisenhower put a partial embargo on Cuba after Fidel Castro's new communist regime seized $1.8 billion of American-owned assets in Cuba between 1959 and 1960. That's $1.8 billion in 1959 money, equivalent to about $17 billion today. Don't worry, I'm sure that inflation is temporary. Then, with congressional support, President Kennedy put a full embargo in place in 1962, after Fidel Castro declared Cuba an ally of the Soviet Union, following America's failed Bay of Pigs invasion. The original embargo was pretty straightforward, but since 1962, the restrictions that make up the embargo have been eased, strengthened, expanded, reduced, expanded again, and ultimately tied into a tangled knot. But one thing is certain. The embargo is full of holes. As of right now, the U.S. embargo on Cuba mainly restricts three things: U.S. trade with Cuba, American travel to Cuba, and American remittances to Cubans, which are gifts of money from private citizens. One thing it doesn't do is prevent Cuba from trading with other countries. Cuba has robust trade with countries like Spain, China, Italy, and even Canada. Yeah, Canada just trades with Cuba, like it's no big deal. Might explain why Justin Trudeau didn't condemn the regime after brutalizing those protesters. Anyway, the U.S. trade embargo doesn't even completely prevent Cuba from trading with the United States. The U.S. embargo has humanitarian exceptions in place for food and medical supplies. It just requires Cuba to pay cash up front. U.S. agricultural exports to Cuba are actually more than $200 million a year, which is about 10% of Cuba's imports. The embargo does restrict American travel to Cuba, but it hasn't always done that very well either. In 2018, Cuba had a record-breaking 4.75 million travelers, Most of these travelers came from Canada and, drumroll please, the United States. That was because President Obama eased travel restrictions. Trump put in some tougher restrictions, but Americans can still go there for certain types of tours. The embargo also limits remittances, that is, gifts of money sent from Americans to Cubans. This is usually money sent from Cuban Americans back to their relatives in Cuba. And yet, over $1 billion in remittances were sent to Cuban families in 2012. President Trump put a cap on remittances, but it was still $2.9 billion in 2020. Now, don't get me wrong, without the embargo, there would be more trade between the United States and Cuba, more travel between the United States and Cuba, and more remittances sent from Americans to Cubans. But the embargo isn't as all-encompassing as some people seem to think. So should the United States end the embargo? I'll get to that after the break. Welcome back. Should the United States end the embargo on Cuba? It depends on who you ask. Those who support the embargo make several points. First, the embargo was designed to stay in place until Cuba met certain conditions, and Cuba still hasn't met those conditions. Initially, the embargo was intended to reduce the threat posed by its alignment with the communist powers. The USSR doesn't exist anymore, so that condition isn't really relevant. But post-Soviet updates to the embargo in 1992 and 1996 set new conditions. Legalize all political activity, release all political prisoners, commit to free and fair elections in the transition to representative democracy, respect freedom of the press, respect internationally recognized human rights, and allow labor unions. Wait, they don't allow labor unions? They're not even good communists. Or are they the best communists? Anyways, those conditions haven't been met. For example, political activity like protesting is still illegal. The Cuban regime still locks up political prisoners. And they don't respect human rights. Or freedom of the press. I mean, I guess technically this journalist was allowed into Cuba before he was beaten. Progress, right? Supporters of the embargo also argue that ending the embargo would make the United States look weak. They point out that Cuba hasn't paid back any of the assets it seized in 1959 and 1960. They also point out that Cuba has a history of taking advantage of softened relations. After President Carter reopened diplomatic relations with Cuba in 1977, Fidel Castro sent 125,000 people he didn't want to Florida, including convicted criminals and mental institution patients. It was called the Mariel Boat Lift. To be fair, a lot of the mental institution patients weren't crazy. They were locked up because they disagreed with communism. They didn't really cause any problems for the United States. They might have even improved Florida. The convicted criminals, on the other hand, they had a lasting effect. They did not improve Florida. It was so bad that when Hollywood remade Scarface in 1983, Tony Montana was written to be one of the Mariel criminals sent by the Cuban regime. It did not end well for anybody. So the United States has looked weak in the past for giving in to Cuba, and Cuba has taken advantage of that weakness. And ending the embargo right now, after President Diaz-Canel arrested protesters and shut down the internet, might just send the wrong message. Some argue the United States has an ethical and moral obligation to promote human rights, and that the embargo is one of the only bargaining tools we have on Cuba. Still, other supporters of the embargo say that since Cuba has a 90% state-owned economy, ending the embargo would only empower the Cuban government rather than help Cuban citizens. President Trump's changes to the embargo in particular were intended to keep remittances out of the hands of Cuban communist officials and in the hands of everyday people. What happened was the Cuban regime and the military had created a system where they could profit from remittances. For example, the company that handles remittances in Cuba is owned by the military. So every time people sent money back to their struggling relatives in Cuba, they had no choice but to send money to the Cuban military. That's just one reason why most Cuban Americans do not support normalizing relations with Cuba. So what reasons are there to end the embargo? I'll get to that after the break. Welcome back. So what are the reasons for the U.S. to end the embargo on Cuba? One argument is that the embargo harms the U.S. economy. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce said in 2012 that the embargo costs the U.S. $1.2 billion annually, while the Cuba Policy Foundation said in 2002 that the embargo could cost as much as $4.8 billion in agricultural exports and related economic output. Meanwhile, Texas A&M University calculated in 2012 that 6,000 jobs could be created in the United States by ending the embargo, particularly in the agricultural sector. Another common argument is that the embargo harms the Cuban people. In other words, Cuba's poor conditions are America's fault. Another argument for ending the embargo is that most Americans want improved diplomatic ties with Cuba. Although that headline is from 2016. Here's one from this month, where most Americans blame communism for Cuba's problems. I suppose technically both can be true. Some Americans can't simultaneously support ending the embargo and blame communism for Cuba's problems. Others argue that free trade promotes democracy. Here's why the Obama administration wanted to ease restrictions on Cuba. The premise of Obama's policy was opening up the island would connect Cubans to a flood of American travelers who would not only bring in some revenue and make life less desperate for Cubans, but also give them more opportunity to interact with the rest of the world and ultimately to pursue political change. That sounds pretty nice. And it was also one of the major arguments behind opening up trade with China back in the late 1990s. That turned out to not work. In fact, it was a miserable failure. We ended up giving lots of money and power to a hostile authoritarian regime that's now trying to take over the world. Whoops. Cuba is not exactly the same as China, but maybe we should think about whether we are empowering Cuban people or just empowering the Cuban regime. That's why many Cuban Americans say more tourists won't bring democracy, it'll just put more power in the hands of the dictatorship. Another argument for ending the embargo is that the embargo prevents the Cuban people from joining the information age, although the Cuban government is already doing their part to keep Cubans in the dark. Still, it is a valid point. Human Rights Watch criticized the high cost of internet in Cuba and limited access for Cubans, which may have something to do with the embargo. And even Senator Rubio wants the United States to get more involved in bringing the internet to Cubans. That way, the Cuban people won't just be censored by the Cuban government, they'll also be censored by American big tech. It's a win-win. Opponents of the embargo also argue that the embargo has failed, that Cuba is not a threat to the United States, and that the embargo is hypocritical given the U.S.'s history of support for brutal dictatorships. That's not fair. The U.S. only supports some brutal dictatorships. But perhaps the best argument for ending the embargo is simply that the Cuban regime wouldn't be able to use it as an excuse anymore. The Cuban regime has blamed the U.S. embargo for pretty much everything since 1962. Which brings us back to the July 11th protests. They're still blaming the U.S. So what do you think? Should the United States end the embargo on Cuba? Let us know in the comments. And remember, America Uncovered is mainly supported by viewers like you. So please visit patreon.com/AmericaUncovered to learn how you can support us with as little as $1 per episode. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thank you for watching America Uncovered.